In this video, I want to tell you about a roguelike that I made. I made this using Claude Code, and I spent about $31 before I stopped using Claude Code and gave up using Claude Code, although I would continue to polish the game in Cursor. So let's dive into this. The very first version that Claude gave me, or at least perhaps maybe 2 or 3 iterations down, I should say, but very sort of early into the journey, within a few minutes, I'd spent 45 cents, and this is on API pricing, and I had a little character and room generation, and I think a little bit of movement at this stage. I can't quite remember if movement was fully working. My notes say that there was movement, but there's also a chance that movement was bugged because it looks like the walls aren't here. There's also a chance that there was walls that you just can't see it because maybe the wall rendering was bugged. Certainly possible. A little while later, and not so long later, this is the progress that I had made. Spending somewhere between $10 to $15, $15 being about the upper end for this. This is on API pricing, so this is actually not the best pricing that you can get, that you can find out there in the wild. This is using Claude Code, using my own API key, and from what I recall of my notes, this is Claude 3.5 or 3.7, perhaps even a little bit of both. Although I'll be honest, I don't quite remember. Probably it wasn't both. It was probably one or the other. I want to say it was Claude 3.5 and then I switched to 3.7, although I'll be honest, I don't quite remember. However, the point is that I had a game, it worked, there was walls even if they didn't render at this point. You had equipment, you had levels, you had experience, and I think there was even combat, if not in this version, not long after it. There is an inventory, and so inventory management system. There was equipment slots, so you could wear certain items. There was items that had classes. As you can see, they're sort of grey, blue, kind of purpley colour, and then green, and that's sort of different rarities. There was even different stats for these items too. So there was something of a functioning system there, and what would look like a pretty decent roguelike for not a lot of money, although actually more expensive than it needs to be. I think you could do this inside something like Cursor or Windsurf for a lot less, because they're able to offer you requests at a lot cheaper rate than you can by yourself going to, the Claude API. Also, the character sheet, which is down here in the bottom right, these stats would update in real time as you're walking around. So I thought that was also pretty neat. And again, this is for sort of $10 to $15, which I don't think it's a lot of money. But I think I remember it being quite rapid. It was really quite fast to get to this stage. And that's one of the things that I want to kind of point out, that I think everyone should know by now that you can use AI with coding to have rapid prototyping. There's obviously issues, challenges, downsides to using AI, but for me it's been a huge game changer. And yes, that's a phrase that's thrown around a lot, but I'm going from being able to thinking about coding a project to actually coding the project and somewhat getting it completed. So as I said before, after a few minutes I had a working map-ish movement for less than $1. This is fairly boilerplate stuff. There's plenty of repos out there in the wild, open source repos, that have roguelikes. So this is pretty easy for AI to do, especially if you were to do this either in Python or in JavaScript, which I was doing in this project. In my notes, I've said that within 1 hour 30 I had the following features, and that is roughly what would be this commensurate with having spent $10 to $15, although I didn't think I'd spent that much within 1 hour 30, although it is definitely possible. Once you start burning through tokens, the price can really add up, and you can burn through tokens trying to fix bugs, and kind of when you fill up the context window, you are burning through tokens every time you make an API call. And that's kind of how it is. So I'm saying here, within 1 hour 30, I had room generation, movement, combat, picking up items, earning XP, and seeing the stats update in real time, which I kind of already said in a previous slide. Some obviously caveats to this is that even though it's working, and working to a decent degree, there can still be little bugs, little things that don't work, things that which may sort of clash, such as you think that you're moving around and everything's fine, you get into combat, everything's fine for a long time, and then maybe you hit across a strange bug where the experience isn't being added on when you thought it should have been, or something, whatever, something strange like that. And it turns out there's just some bug, the way that something's being registered or not registered, perhaps as the case might be, and you then have to go and try and figure out what that is, and you have to try and debug it, and that can take a lot of time and money. So even though I'm saying that these features were in the game, of course, there's always, I remember there being bugs. It wasn't perfect code. It wasn't like a perfect game. But I don't think it's reasonable to expect that even if you've done a lot of polishing, there's generally always still bugs. There's generally always still things that need to be fixed. And this is kind of me, this leads into the next logical issue. When reality hits and you're trying to do some bug fixes and you get these logical loops where the AI thinks it solved the problem, but it actually hasn't, and it keeps trying and it doesn't quite get there. In most roguelikes, at least the traditional ones, you have floors such that you generate a dungeon segment, whatever you want to call it, you fight through it, and then you get to the stairs, and then you go up or you go down, so you go to a different floor, and then you start dungeon generation all over again, and you fight monsters, etc., find the next set of stairs and go up or down or whatever it is. So I wanted to do something a little bit different. I actually wanted to go sideways rather than upwards. So I had a gate system, and this caused a lot of headaches. Claude managed to create something, and something that kind of worked, but was also bugged. You could go into one section and then try to come back, and then the section didn't exist, and it would kind of maybe throw you back all the way to 0, rather than correctly back to the section that you just previously been in. So there was a lot of logical sort of bugs within that were really hard to fix, and I eventually had to fix it myself rather than relying on AI. I just couldn't do it. The gates are on the walls of the dungeon segments, rather than randomly within a room. They're at the extremities of the dungeon segment. The gates are obviously bi-directional, so you can go through it one way and then come back. So you have to remember where you've been, and obviously all of the layouts associated with that. So there's a pseudo-infinite extent to the dungeon, because you can theoretically keep going forever. Obviously in reality you can't, but that's besides the point. I also tried to add multiplayer, but I stopped that, and I took that code out, as it also turned out to be something that you can create very fast. So again, rapid prototyping. You can make very quick progress, but also the bugs can creep in rather quickly, and then they can become a real pain to diagnose and to get fixed. And it was distracting me from what I was trying to do, which was create the game. And so clearly wasn't worth it at the time, although I think it's something that I will return to. Here is a picture of the game. So you can see here I've actually got the walls finally rendering. There is a fog of war. I'm coming from the top, so the top is section 00, which is where you start, and then at the bottom is section 0-1, and so you go south from your first section, and then eventually you hit the gate, and then you come through the gate into the next section where you have to then generate rooms, generate the dungeon, that whole dungeon segment. And this is pretty, simple. When I describe it to you in the video, you're probably thinking, oh yeah, that sounds, simple. But actually in reality it was a little bit tricky. Or a lot, really quite tricky. You want it to be such that you can always go back through the gates. That's the design that I wanted. You have some interesting issues that if you have a pseudo infinite extent as I did, and how to handle the gates such that, do you have a gate on every wall, so the major walls north, south, east and west, or do you have it only on some? And then what does that mean if you can go through one gate on one wall, and then can you potentially get stuck such that you can't go further if the gates are, say, randomly assigned where it may appear on a wall but then it may not? And there was a few headaches in that. I eventually just went for having one gate upon every major wall, the sort of the edges of the dungeon, shall we say. I don't think there's actually a wall at the very, very edge of each dungeon segment that goes all the way around, but yeah, it's not the feel that I wanted. Also doesn't particularly really matter. Moving on, further still, is highly related to the last point about the logical loops, is the debug file explosion. Claude, well actually this is probably not unique to Claude, but AI, I suppose, LLMs, they love to create debug files where they can do some testing, and then if it doesn't quite work, they can create the same file all over again in a slightly different way, with slightly different code, maybe even slightly different variable names, but essentially basically just the same solution. And it will do this near enough endlessly, especially on something like the gate system. It just couldn't quite figure it out, it just couldn't fix it, and it kept trying the same things over and over again and not figuring out what the issue was. And it's quite frustrating to go through that for it to say, oh, let's have some more debug statements, let's just print things to the console. And while it helps to print something out to the console and to try and print more and more to find where the bug actually is, sometimes it's not always the most helpful to create like all of these different text files. You want to be working in as few files as possible, is at least what I've been finding. So I can tell you about the latest progress as of recording this in October of 2025. The game is working. There is code on GitHub, it's open source. There is an instance deployed to Vercel so you can play. There is room generation, there's items, there's combat, there is experience to be gained, items that you can pick up, the gate system works. So overall I'm pretty happy with it, although it definitely isn't finished. And I have a little list at the end of the video of the features that I want to add. So as I've suggested, I moved away from Claude Code, I moved to Cursor, and then I eventually moved to Windsurf, as I think I've probably said in a previous video. And that was a help. It was, for me, it's just working in the command line is just not that fun, and it's also difficult to kind of get a feel for what's going on. It is much, much, much easier to work inside an IDE. Obviously, as I've mentioned before, Claude 4 has also been released. Now, at the time of recording, Claude 4.5 has also been released, although I haven't used that for this project, so I can't really comment on that within the context of this game. Some of the bigger changes that I've made since finishing with Claude Code and moving into Cursor was to overhaul combat. It's a little bit less random now. It's not just like random numbers that pop up. It's a little bit more meaningful to do with the level of the character, from what I recall, and the items that the character is holding and actually has equipped. Items are more scarce. They used to pop up a lot. They just to be sort of peppered all over the dungeon floor. Monsters used to only drop gold, but now they also drop items. Gates, as I've said a few times now, are linking reliably. There's no bugs as far as I'm aware, which is great. And then lastly, I sort of tweaked the inventory management and the equipment displaying. There was a few bugs there that were a little bit annoying. I think one of them was like, if you picked up a potion, you could keep picking up infinitely many potions and it wouldn't like affect things. I debate with myself as to whether that's a good thing or not, as to whether you want to just let the player pick up as many potions as possible or whether you want to limit it. But I think whenever it came to drinking the potion, it was never deducted from your inventory. So you picked up one potion, I think you'd therefore have an infinite number. So I fixed that. It was a little bit of a headache, as it wasn't entirely clear what was going on with the code. And that's kind of what happens whenever you're using AI, is that you are detached from the code, and so you have less clue about what's going on at that sort of fundamental level. However, that doesn't mean that you can't necessarily, go through a debugging strategy, figure out where the problem is, and then try to fix it. You still can. You can still even have AI to fix your problems and to do the debugging with you, rather than you doing it alone without AI. You're also, whenever you're working with AI, you're working at a slightly higher level of thought. You're thinking more about, say, architectures, how things fit together at a higher level rather than at a low level. I think, for sure, AI is much better coding than I am, and it will always be that way. And to some extent, I don't kind of care what the code looks like, as long as it works. Now, that's not entirely true. There's a whole bunch of caveats there that I'm not going to get into in this video. However, I think the code that's produced from AI does look pretty decent. Again, there's a bunch of caveats there where it's not always the case, but it does look probably better than anything that I would write. What have I learned? I think I've covered some of this already. Obviously, the tools matter, so going from Claude Code to Cursor was a big help, a huge help. Having better models come out gives you some improvement, not as big of an improvement, but it certainly helps. And then my own kind of personal skill level, which is where I've become better at using AI, I've become better at using these tools, I've become better at demanding, say, documentation for my project as I go, and that really helps to make sure that the outcome and what you're asking of AI is better than otherwise. Just asking for something simple in a prompt doesn't always give you a good outcome. Having documentation really helps a lot, because you can ask the AI to refer back to the documentation. Another sort of key point here is that complexity is often the enemy of progress, i.e. adding multiplayer was an interesting complexity, and I wouldn't say it was a failure. There was a lot of learning that I did in that process, but in order to make progress and to move forward, it was easier just to remove multiplayer, simplify it, and then continue. Again, I may add multiplayer back in later, and of course taking a break from what you're doing and coming back to it later on with fresh eyes. So I've generally always got a few projects going on at the same time that I can kind of dip in and out of as I make progress, get stuck, and then I want to go and make progress elsewhere. Sometimes inspiration will come to me, and then I'll come back to an old project that I was working on, such as this one that I've come back to a few times. What's next for this game? Well, I want to add more monster types, more behaviors. I could add sort of I've got a magic system that I've got on this slide, so giving a magic system for the player, but I could also add a magic system for monsters. You could imagine that monsters could have a stun capability. I'm not sure if I will add that. Sometimes it's annoying, but then at the same time it's also another factor with strategy. I also would like to add multiplayer, but it's not going to be a priority. I probably should have a saving and loading functionality. This would mean adding a database, which is definitely doable, and I have got a database in another project that I've made. I just shied away from doing it here as I wanted to make progress faster with the actual game parts rather than the back end part. And then another thing I would quite like to add is a better progression system. Not entirely sure how I'll do this. You know, it could be like a talent tree. These are just things that are going through my mind, things which are quite familiar, I think, to most players anyway, from various MMOs. So yeah, I'm not sure what else I want to really say on that. I think that's most things that I want to say, kind of how the progress went, things that I've learned. Of course, I'm more on the optimistic side of using AI while coding, or with broadly anything. And hopefully you found that interesting. If you want to try the game out, you can find it. I should probably put the links into the description. Hopefully I remember to do that. At the very least, I should hope to put it onto GitHub. Put the GitHub link into the description, and then you can follow that link to Vercel in order to play it, test it, and also to see the code. And I think that's everything I pretty much wanted to say for this video, and maybe in a future video I will return to this project and tell you a little bit more about what's happening. One thing that would help me, of course, is if people subscribe. In the early days it helps to boost the algorithm, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you very much.